August 20th, 2011. The day Gaddafi fell. After 42 years in power, the controversial and extravagant leader Livio met his end in a global landscape that was divided between considering him a martyr or the very personification of terror. Almost a decade after his death, who was the man who dominated one of the territories that today continues to be the axis of a bloody war? After the Second World War, Libya fell into French and British hands. Prior to that, it had been a colony of Italy, which had snatched it from the Ottoman Empire, but could not stand against the Allies despite Germany's help. It seems like a game of chess in which the goal is to conquer Libya. The truth is that the Allies cannot agree on what to do with Libya, and the UN considers it appropriate to grant independence to the country, giving power to King Idris of the Senussi dynasty. Suddenly, Libya is the first African colony to achieve its emancipation. And how does it celebrate? Toasting, but with oil. Yes, because Libya is full of oil. And what does oil bring to a prosperous country? No, sorry, I said prosperity. No, I meant death and destruction. Libya's oil is eyed hungrily by mercenary foreign companies that, thanks to Idris, who had been an ally of the Allies, managed to enter the country in exchange for a large sum of money. The distribution of the exorbitant profits generated by this business is only for a few, and it doesn't take long until inequality among the local inhabitants occurs. On one hand, there was extreme poverty, and on the other, a lot of money and waste. In Libya, there were no middle grounds. The monarchy begins to appear in the eye of popular discontent, and in 1969, King Idris is overthrown while he was on vacation. As we all know, a crocodile that sleeps becomes a wallet. It is then that a revolutionary military council is established, commanded by a 27-year-old colonel. A young man who had graduated in law, a young man who had stood out for his intelligence, but who had also been expelled from educational institutions for his anarchist and extreme thoughts. A certain Gaddafi, who thus begins his reign, which would keep him in power for more than 4 decades, with Libya in his hands. 4 decades that would consecrate him as one of the most controversial political figures of recent times. When Gaddafi came to power, in the African nation there were no schools, university graduates were just 16, there were no doctors, and only 250,000 inhabitants out of a total of 4 million knew how to read and write. Through the Green Revolution, the name of the movement founded by Gaddafi, Libya underwent some drastic changes. A social security system was promoted, and access to water, education, and free healthcare was guaranteed, while workers were allowed to participate in the state's profits. The assets of the Italians and Israelis were confiscated, and the oil industry was nationalized. The standard of living rose, crime fell, class differences were leveled, the government granted loans and machinery support for Libyans who wanted to use their land for agricultural work. Citizens were assisted in acquiring homes, and the bank offered zero credit loans. But that was just one side of Gaddafi's empire. In parallel to the implementation of these policies, Gaddafi associated with anti-imperialist terrorist groups, supported neighboring dictatorial leaders, where he also made military interventions and joined the trend of building nuclear weapons, which began to be frowned upon by the rest of the countries, with the United States being the country that takes the idea of building him as a public enemy with greater enthusiasm. Because we all know that the United States loves freedom, democracy, but above all it loves the dark liquid that is produced by dinosaur fossils. The Americans accused Gaddafi of planning an assassination against Ronald Reagan and of financing an attack in Berlin, more precisely where Yankee soldiers attended, and in 1986 they bombed his residence in Tripoli. The colonel escaped, but the bomb killed 101 Libyans, including Gaddafi's 2-year-old daughter. Gaddafi's family proclaimed revenge, and the impending confrontation promised to be devastating, but of course nothing that a few bills couldn't fix. With economic sanctions over his head from the UN, Gaddafi understands that the most convenient strategy is to retract and halt the development of his weapons of mass destruction, while also abandoning his sponsorship of and towards terrorism, but above all, allows the entry of oil companies into Libya. He goes from being hated to being a spoiled child. The ties are finally strengthened when the post-September 11th West and Gaddafi join forces against Al-Qaeda. Gaddafi becomes more and more obsessed with power, and slowly a particular and atrocious background begins to emerge. On one hand, we have a colorful anecdote of Eccentricities. One of his sons had a cruise ship with a pool of sharks. He traveled the world, carrying in a separate plane a bulletproof tent, camels, and his own harem. He had his own entourage of tasters who tested everything he ate or drank because of his fears of being poisoned. He didn't use elevators and never went beyond the 35th step of a staircase. The higher you are, the more chance you have of being exposed to an attack. Paranoid? Maybe. That doesn't change the fact that there have been many attempts on his life. Artists like Mariah Carey, Beyoncé, and Bon Jovi have reportedly performed for Gaddafi at private shows. His family fought over control of Coca-Cola in Libyan territory. There were fights on different sides, and the mafias bid to see who was going to take over the company's domain within the country. Gaddafi, for his part, even said that Coca-Cola was giving money to Africa since many of its components came from those lands. A lovely madman, but not so much, and not only because of those Botox surgeries that would end up deforming him and would give him demonic features similar to those of Scar, the villain from The Lion King. On the other hand, we have the absolute darkness. A regime based on torture, oppression, censorship, violations, excess, and abuses. Full house for Gaddafi. Gaddafi had a retinue of female bodyguards who accompanied him everywhere. Armed to the teeth, this entourage was called the Amazonian Guard. While many of these women died defending Gaddafi, it was eventually discovered that they were actually abused daily and were more a fantasy of a sexual deviant than a real defense group. Gaddafi's defenders indicate that he granted Libyan women the necessary rights to study and gain more freedoms. But to honor the truth, it must be noted that he also professed thoughts where the role of women was clear and undisputed within the family, always at the disposal of the man. Gaddafi subjected women of all ages during his empire to demonstrate his authority and male supremacy. He also exerted constant pressure on his opponents. Either they let themselves be bribed or they didn't tell the story. Don't you like my regime? There's a board. You like my regime, but you don't want to follow my orders. There's a board, and so on with everything. His thoughts and actions include bandaged and tied up soldiers in clandestine prisons, and the recruitment of minors to whom they gave weapons and encouraged them to go out and kill to maintain control. Your control. In the year 2010, a series of Arab protests began that manifested in favor of democracy and the human and social rights of the population. The dictatorial governments began to falter. In Libya, the so-called Arab Spring blossomed with particular fervor, and many thousands took to the streets proclaiming against the government. Gaddafi did not hesitate to label his detractors as cockroaches, who were under the influence of psychedelic drugs, and ordered them to be annihilated without mercy in a historic and excessive repression. Again, ties with the West were cut off by this action, and countries like the United States of America, Italy, France, Spain, Canada, among others, joined the line seeking to overthrow the colonel. On August 20th of the year 2011, after the Battle of Tripoli, Gaddafi's regime fell, and it would be 2 months until the leader was finally captured and killed while begging for mercy. Myth and reality intersect in the figure of Gaddafi. Many world leaders remember him with fear, others remember him with respect. There are many who speak of his undeniable charisma and the courage of his anti-colonial visions, and do not hesitate to paint him as an Arab Che Guevara. His followers maintain to this day that what happened in Libya was not a real uprising, but rather a North Atlantic Treaty Organization front moved by the West in order to take over an oil-rich area and finally eliminate who they considered a problem. For others, Gaddafi was simply a manipulative and unscrupulous strategist who had managed to seduce the world powers with his access to oil. His death was mourned and celebrated in equal measure. He was remembered around the world with tears and gunshots in the air. Libya is fragmented today. The armed conflict claimed more than 5,000 people. Millions decided to leave their home and their economy plummeted. 9 years after Gaddafi's death, the country's situation remains complex. It was considered high intensity and seems far from being resolved. The overthrow of the legendary leader is being questioned. While his actions were not an option, it is clear that no one was prepared for the hell that would break loose after his death. And that's it for today's video. We were discussing a political topic. I hope you found the day Gaddafi fell interesting. A whole story full of oil, arrangements between nations, wars of convenience and more. If you liked it, please, I invite you to leave your like. Subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And obviously, I invite you to continue watching more videos from this channel. I leave you a couple of recommended ones related to this topic at the end of this video. My name is Magnus Mephisto, and this was The Day That